The 41st millennium is a nightmare of unrelenting war, where faith and firepower collide in an eternal struggle. But beyond bolt guns and chainswords, beyond the screaming battle cries of the damned, lies a force far more terrifying, one that bends reality itself, rips minds apart, and can summon horrors from the darkest depths of existence. Psychic power. In Warhammer 40,000, Psykers are individuals with the ability to tap into the warp, a chaotic, ever-shifting dimension of raw energy and emotion. The Imperium sees them as both a necessary evil and a dire threat. Chaos uses them to wreak destruction on an unimaginable scale. Xenos races wield psychic might in ways the Imperium can barely comprehend. But psychic power comes at a cost. For every smiting librarian or far-sighted Eldar, there are hundreds of unfortunate Psykers who become victims of demonic possession, insanity, or spontaneous combustion. The warp is not to be trifled with. Today, we'll explore every single psychic power in Warhammer 40K, from the burning wrath of pyromancy to the sinister mind tricks of telepathy, from the Adeptus Astartes librarians to the grotesque Weirdboyz of the Orks. We're diving into the deepest secrets of the warp. Brace yourself, because this is going to get very grim dark. Before we continue with the video and my further explanation about the lore Warhammer 40K legions, I want to ask for your help. I'm trying to reach 5,000 subs before the grim darkness future starts, so I'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe and help me out. And let's win this battle together. Okay, let's continue. Understanding psychic disciplines. Not all Psykers are the same. Some manipulate the mind, others reshape the battlefield with fire and force. To harness the warp's energy, Psykers follow specific psychic disciplines, each representing a different manifestation of raw power. Let's break them down. Biomancy, the art of flesh crafting. Biomancers wield psychic energy to enhance the body, regenerate wounds, or even warp flesh into a weapon. A skilled biomancer can turn a frail human into a towering juggernaut of muscle or rot an enemy's organs with a mere thought. Space Marine Librarians favor biomancy for its self-augmentation, while Chaos Sorcerers use it to morph their bodies into terrifying monstrosities. Notable powers. Iron Arm. Increases a warrior's strength and durability beyond mortal limits, enfeebles saps an enemy's physical strength, turning even a mighty warrior into a weakling. Warp Speed grants superhuman speed and reflexes, allowing a Psyker to strike before an enemy can react. Divination, the sight beyond sight. The best weapon in war is knowledge, and divination gives Psykers an unnatural ability to predict the future. Farseers of the Eldar craft worlds are unparalleled in this art, bending fate itself to their will. The Imperium's astropaths use it to navigate the warp, while librarians employ it to anticipate enemy movements. Notable powers. Prescience allows an ally to strike with impossible accuracy. Forewarning grants a near-impossible chance to evade incoming attacks. Scryer's Gaze unveils enemy tactics before they unfold, letting commanders adjust their strategy. Pyromancy, fire and wrath. Some Psykers don't bother with subtlety. Pyromancers unleash firestorms, melt armor, and incinerate squads in an instant. The Salamanders and Thousand Sons both favor pyromancy, though one fights for humanity and the other for chaos. Inferno, a raging storm of warp-fueled fire engulfs enemies. Molten Beam, a searing energy lance that can burn through Terminator armor. Fire Shield, a defensive wall of flames that incinerates attackers before they can strike. Telekinesis, the power of the mind. Telekinesis is raw force, crushing foes and lifting tanks or conjuring psychic barriers. The Grey Knights master this discipline, using it to hurl demons aside like ragdolls. Notable powers. Levitation allows a Psyker to float across the battlefield. Shockwave sends enemies flying with an explosive burst of force. Crush compresses a target's body into a bloody pulp. Telepathy, masters of the mind. Telepaths don't just read minds, they shatter them. This discipline is as deadly as it is insidious, allowing Psykers to control enemies, instill terror, or shut down a foe's brain entirely. The Alpha Legion, Night Lords, and Inquisition Exploit these abilities for maximum psychological warfare. Notable powers. Dominate. Forces an enemy to obey against their will. Terrify. Induces overwhelming fear, causing enemies to flee. Mental fortitude. Shields allies from mind control and insanity. The warp is limitless, and so are its dangers. But knowing the disciplines is only the beginning. Now, let's see how different factions wield these terrifying abilities. Psychic powers by faction. Psychic energy isn't just another weapon in Warhammer 40K, it's a force that shapes entire civilizations. The way each faction wields the warp says everything about who they are. Some use it as a tool of war, others as a means of survival, and some just let the warp run wild and hope for the best. The Imperium of Man, power-bound in chains. The Imperium hates Psykers. They fear them, but they also need them. Without astropaths, interstellar communication would be impossible. Without navigators, fleets would be lost in the warp forever. And without the Adeptus Astartes librarians, entire worlds would fall to the horrors lurking just beyond reality. Space Marine Librarians, elite warrior psychers who wield powers like Smite, a brutal blast of warp energy that vaporizes enemies. Grey Knights, the Emperor's psychic elite, using abilities like banishment to obliterate demons. Astra Militarum sanctioned psychers. Feared and barely tolerated, these psychers channel unstable power through abilities like Night Shroud, which cloaks their allies in warp-born darkness. Sisters of Battle, they despise psychers, but their acts of faith function like miracles, defying logic and reason in a way that feels eerily psychic. Chaos, masters of corruption. Chaos embraces the warp fully. Where Imperial Psykers struggle to control their power, Chaos Sorcerers revel in it, twisting reality like a plaything. But their greatest strength is also their greatest weakness. The warp is chaos, and chaos is fickle. Chaos Space Marine Sorcerers, twisted reflections of the Emperor's librarians, wielding powers like Infernal Gaze, which can melt through armor like wax. Thousand Suns, once scholars, now walking sorcerers, whose very essence is tied to the warp. They cast devastating spells, like temporal manipulation, warping time itself. Demons of Chaos. Each Chaos God grants its followers unique psychic horrors. Tzeentch Psykers rain down warp fire and rewrite fate. Nurgle Psykers spread plagues through stream of corruption. Slaanesh Psykers manipulate the senses, making enemies see and hear things that aren't real. Khorne despises Psykers, his answer to psychic power, a chain axe to the face. Xenos races beyond human understanding. While the Imperium chains its Psykers and Chaos indulges them, the Xenos have their own unique approaches to the warp. Eldar Eldari, the Farseers of the craft worlds, wield psychic powers as effortlessly as breathing. They use abilities like Doom, marking a target for certain death, and Guide, ensuring their warriors strike with pinpoint accuracy. Dark Eldar Drukhari. They avoid the warp entirely. Instead of psychic powers, they feed off suffering, growing stronger through sheer depravity. Orks don't understand Psykers, but they do understand way energy. Weirdboyz tap into this and release it in chaotic explosions of power. Sometimes it works, sometimes their heads explode. That's Ork life. Tyranids. The hive mind itself is a vast psychic entity. Tyranid Psykers, like zoanthropes, unleash devastating abilities like the Horror, which drowns enemy minds in sheer terror. The Necrons despise Psykers. They don't have psychic powers, but they have weapons that erase them. Ancient tech designed to shut down the warp entirely. The psychic battlefield is as chaotic as the 41st millennium itself. For every Psyker hurling fireballs, there's another being ripped apart by a demon. And speaking of that, what happens when things go wrong? Risks and perils of the warp. Power always comes with a price, and in the Warhammer 40K universe, that price is usually horrific death, possession, or spontaneous combustion. Psychic powers don't just come from nowhere, they draw directly from the warp, the nightmarish dimension of raw energy where demons lurk, waiting for an opportunity to break through. Perils of the warp, when everything goes wrong. Every time a Psyker reaches into the warp, there's a chance that something pulls back, The most infamous example is Perils of the Warp, a tabletop mechanic that represents a Psyker losing control of their power in the worst possible way. And when that happens, the results are never pretty. Best case scenario, the Psyker suffers agonizing pain as raw warp energy burns through their mind. Mid-tier disaster, a massive psychic explosion incinerates the Psyker and anyone standing too close. Absolute worst case, a demon tears through reality, possesses the Psyker's body, and goes on a murderous rampage. This is why the Imperium chains their Psykers and executes the unstable ones on sight. How factions deal with psychic risks. The Imperium. Librarians and sanctioned Psykers train rigorously, but failure means death or worse. The Inquisition isn't shy about purging an entire regiment if a Psyker loses control. Chaos. Chaos Psykers have immense power, but are always at risk of demonic corruption. Many sorcerers end up as mindless chaos spawn, a fate far worse than death. Xenos. The Eldar's spirit stones help them resist corruption, while Orks just don't care. If a Weirdboy explodes, that's just part of the fun. Necrons, as always, have zero tolerance for anything warp-related. Using psychic power is like playing with a loaded bolter aimed at your own head. Eventually, it's going to go off. And that brings us to our next question. How have these powers evolved across different editions of the game? Evolution of psychic powers in game editions. Warhammer 40K has changed a lot over the years, and psychic powers have evolved alongside it. What started as a chaotic, barely controlled mechanic has become a fundamental part of the game, sometimes too fundamental. The early years, wild and unpredictable, Rogue Trader and 2nd edition. Back in the early days, psychic powers were insane. Psykers were unpredictable. Their abilities worked like spells in a tabletop RPG, and they could single-handedly turn the tide of a battle, or implode spectacularly. There were cards for psychic powers, a psychic phase that felt like a minigame, and a whole lot of random nonsense. Psykers could mind control entire squads, set entire battlefields on fire, or just die horribly when things went wrong. Some powers were overpowered beyond belief. A good librarian could solo an entire battlefield if the dice favored him. But the middle years, psychic phases take shape, 3rd to 7th edition. As Warhammer 40K became more structured, psychic powers got reined in. The psychic phase became more controlled, with specific disciplines like biomancy, pyromancy, etc., introduced in 6th edition. Psykers were still strong, but they weren't battlefield-dominating gods anymore. The perils of the warp became more refined, making psychic powers less of a guaranteed win and more of a calculated risk. 8th and 9th edition, psychic powers as a core mechanic. With 8th and 9th edition, psychic powers became a key part of competitive play. Each faction had unique abilities. Smite became every Psyker's go-to attack, and Grey Knights and Thousand Suns dominated with powerful spell lists. Now, in 10th edition, the psychic phase is gone entirely. Psychic powers now function as regular abilities. No more dedicated psychic phase, just fast, deadly, faction-specific powers. The warp is still dangerous. The psychic arms race continues. And as long as Psykers exist, there will be heroes, horrors, and catastrophic failures. Notable Psykers in Warhammer 40,000 lore. Some Psykers are more than just powerful. They are legends. Their names are whispered in fear, revered in worship, or burned into the history of the 41st millennium. These Psykers aren't just wielders of the warp, they define the galaxy's greatest wars. Imperial Psykers, heroes bound by duty. Ezekiel, chief librarian of the Dark Angels. A Psyker of unmatched skill, Ezekiel's foresight and telepathic might help the Dark Angels hunt their darkest secrets. Mephiston, Lord of Death. The only Blood Angel to ever conquer the Black Rage, Mephiston's psychic abilities make him almost godlike in battle. He wields sanguinary powers that turn him into an unstoppable force. Chaos, Psykers, masters of the dark arts. Ahriman, of the Thousand Suns. Once the chief librarian of his legion, Ahriman is arguably the greatest mortal Psyker alive. His infamous rubric of Ahriman cursed his own brothers, trapping them in soulless armor for eternity. Magnus the Red Demon. Primarch and one of the most powerful Psykers in history, Magnus can bend reality, rip apart planets, and obliterate fleets with a thought. Xenos Psykers beyond human understanding. Eldrad Ulthran, the greatest Farseer of the Eldar, Eldrad's divination powers have shaped the fate of entire star systems. He is one of the few beings who has outplayed both Chaos and the Imperium. Weirdboyz, Orks. While no single Weirdboy stands out, Ork Psykers as a whole are insanely dangerous. Their power scales with how many Orks are nearby, meaning they can become walking nukes in a full Waaagh. From saviors to destroyers, Psykers have shaped history in ways that even the God Emperor himself couldn't always predict. Conclusion: the galaxy of Warhammer 40K is built on war, faith, and brutality. But psychic power is the wild card that can change everything, from the disciplined librarians of the Imperium to the sorcerous nightmares of chaos, from the cold calculation of the Eldar to the sheer randomness of Ork Weirdboyz. Psykers shape the fate of entire civilizations. But power comes at a cost. The warp is unforgiving. One mistake, one misstep, and a Psyker might not just lose their life, they might doom a world. In the 41st millennium, psychic power is a weapon, and sometimes the most dangerous one of all.